Okay artists, today I'm going to show you guys how to jelly print textures. Here are the materials that we're going to be needing for today. We're going to need our jelly plate. As you can see, this jelly plate is well loved, and you can tell because it has remnants of paint all over it. If yours is brand new, great. If yours is well worn like this one, no problem, because if it's still sticky on both sides, it's still good. So no worries if it's a little bit beat up like this one. We are going to need a brayer. A brayer is what we're going to use so that we can distribute the paint on our jelly plate. We're going to need some acrylic paints in different colors. I'm using Liquitex Basics, but any brand will be fine. Just make sure it does have a heavy body. Heavy body meaning that when I go and squeeze a little bit out, there's a certain thickness to it. If it's too watery, it's not going to print as nicely on your jelly plate. Several pieces of paper so that we can make several different prints at the same time. I'm using mixed media paper here so that it doesn't become brittle and buckle when it's wet. And we're going to need several different things to create textures. So I'm going to be using yarn, feathers, and I'm going to be using some bubble wrap. Whatever you have for texture will be fine. Lastly, we're going to need some wet paper towels, or ideally wet kitchen towels, like the ones that you would dry your hands on. Just moisten them, and this is going to be good for when we need to clean off our brayer. I'm going to position the paper towels to the right of my jelly plate. You will position them to the left if you're left-handed. And I'm going to place my brayer on top. If this happens where your jelly plate sticks to your surface, you might want to consider putting on the jelly plate on some kind of piece of plastic wrap like I'm doing right here, or a piece of chipboard so that it doesn't necessarily stick to your table. So for now, I'm going to be using the plastic wrap as my my surface here. To get started, I'm going to take some paint and I'm going to squeeze a minute amount of paint. You really don't need that much. That right there is more than enough to fill this 5x7 jelly plate. And then I'm going to spread it. You want to spread it evenly throughout the jelly plate. You can roll the paint in any direction you want. You might notice that I put my brayer, facing up instead of facing down on a napkin. That's because I want to use more of that paint later on, and I don't want to waste it by rubbing it on the napkin. So just a little trick for you guys to be conscious of. Now I'm going to go and layer over some textures, and like I said, I really want to start out with some yarn so that I can create some lines across the surface of my print. Having done so, I'm going to take a sheet of paper. The paper is clearly bigger than the jelly plate. The plate is clearly smaller than the piece of paper, but that's okay because I'm actually going to be trimming my prints later. I'm just going to go and align to the bottom of my plate, and then I'm going to go and take my hands and give it a firm massage. It helps if you also use another brayer, a clean brayer on top, so that you can basically try to transfer all of that paint onto the paper. I'm going to lift from a corner, and this is what my print looks like so far. So you can see I have really clear negative space right here being the green, and then the positive space is just the white that didn't get printed on because the yarn was masking off those areas. I'm going to leave this to dry, which should take a few seconds because it's only my first layer. And I'm actually going to go and lift all of this yarn. And you can see that the yarn left kind of like a really interesting mark all over the jelly plate. And I want to take advantage of that by laying down a second sheet of paper. And I'm going to pull what's called a ghost print. A ghost print basically is a print of your very first one, so it uses all the residue of paint that is still left on your jelly plate to create a really interesting ghostly second print on your piece of paper. So I'm going to lift gently so that my paper does not tear, And you can see what a cool ghost print that made. It's actually more interesting to me, in fact, than the very first print I created, because this one actually went and got all the textures of the yarn, so you can kind of see all the contours of the yarn around it. I'm gonna go and trim this later once they're dry, but as my first ghost print, it looks pretty cool, so I'm gonna let it dry for a few seconds before printing on it again. Now I'm gonna go in with a little bit more of the paint that I had left in my brayer, and I'm gonna lighten it with some yellow. You guys can of course use whatever colors you want to. I'm going to use mostly a cool color scheme today, meaning that I'm using blues, greens, purples, and I'm using a little bit of yellow to create more of a lime green. Now I'm going to try printing with some feathers. So these are just feathers from the craft store. I'm basically going and separating the little bristles on the feather so I can create more interesting marks across my jelly plate. And I'm going to pull a third print. Once again, going to give it a firm massage with my fingers. If you have a clean brayer that you can do this with, it's actually even easier than using your hand. And it's okay if you get paint on your hand, you can just wash it off later. And again, I'm going to gently pull a print. And once again, I have a really defined positive and negative space relationship here, where the positive space is just the feather that was blocking off all of that paint, and the negative is the lime green. When I pull off the feather, I can see that the stick on the feather actually made like a really deep indentation. So I'm going to make a ghost print of this. Give it a firm massage and then gradually start lifting it. And this is ghost print number 2, where now you can see all of that texture being created by the hairs or the bristles on the feather itself. And I should have about 3 different textures before I decide if I'm going to just leave the textures and enjoy the print on its own, or if I decide to follow it up with a stencil or a mask so that I can print even more cool negative shapes on top. Okay, artists, I have made lots and lots of different textured prints. Several of these look really abstract because of the materials that I was using to capture the texture. Theoretically, they're beautiful on their own, and I could use them on their own without collaging them or without adding any more content on top. But I'm going to show you how you can take very abstract prints of texture like this and make them a little extra special through the use of stencils. What you guys are going to need is something to use as a stencil. Here you can see I was cutting out some big letters like so, and I basically just went and traced these on to normal paper. You can also use chipboard or a piece of acetate to create a stencil like this. And I also have several other pieces with mostly geometric shapes like circles and stars that I cut out of just normal cardstock. And I'm going to be using these as stencils today. Because many of my prints already have a lot of bright colors, like bright blues and bright yellows and greens, I'm going to be using mostly contrasting colors and neutrals like black and white today. And I'm doing this because I want there to be a very clear difference between the layer I'm creating with the stencil from the layer that I created with the textured materials. So I'm going to start out by adding a little bit of black. A little goes a long way. And rolling it out with my brayer. And I think first I'm gonna start using some of these stencils that I created out of basically scrap paper. And it is fairly big, and that's okay with me because it's gonna look more abstract when I print it onto my paper. So I'm gonna use this abstracted print of the feathers, which is now dry to the touch. It needs to be dry to the touch. And I'm gonna put it down and give it a firm massage, and then carefully lift it. You can see how the stencil was blocking off this whole big mark, and now I have very clear negative and positive space here, the negative space being the black and the positive is still this area remaining And I think I really like the fact that it has this movement, this curvy movement throughout the print. And later on, when it's dry, I'm basically going to take a scissors and cut all of that white border off, so it's just the print on its own, and it's going to look gorgeous. I'm going to put this one aside. And I'm going to lift this. I could create a ghost print out of this, but I'm not going to. I'm going to roll a little bit more black paint on top. And then use a different stencil. I'm using a lot of abstract stencils here. You can always use stencils with recognizable imagery such as people, animals, and so forth as well. You see here's another really interesting abstract print of texture. Again, I'm going to align it with my jelly plate, give it a firm massage, and it makes this really, really interesting positive to negative space relationship that I'm totally digging here. It especially helps that I'm using black because it has such a high contrast to the bright colors underneath. If I was using more blue, for example, and there's already a lot of blue with the initial print, it wouldn't be as obvious that I was using a stencil, and I wouldn't have much contrast. So I'm going to continue printing, just adding a little bit more paint to my plate so it's nice and wet. And this time I'm going to use some slightly more recognizable imagery. So I'm going to use some of these stars. And it's okay if the stencil goes outside of the plate like this circle. And I suggest you guys kind of think about how you're composing all of these different stencils onto your plate to create a more interesting final result. So I'm laying the print side down, giving the back of the paper a firm massage, and gently lifting. So later, when the print is dry to the touch, I'm going to cut these white borders, and then I'll just have this print on its own to do with as I wish. Alright, so let's take a look at some of my prints now, after I've gone and used those handmade stencils. So I'm really, really liking the black background and how it really contrasts with all of this beautiful texture that I was doing underneath. I can continue laying on as many more stencils as I want to until I'm happy with the print. And again, once they're dry, I can basically go and start collaging with these prints or display them on their own as is. So I encourage you guys to try to make as many different textures as possible and then use handmade stencils for a more interesting look. And I cannot wait to see all of your prints. So I hope you enjoyed. Peace out.